At 6:18 a.m. on March 4, 1944, Staff Sergeant Eddie Malloy stood on the hardstand at RAF Bassingbourn, with his hands buried in his coat pockets, watching a B-17 roll back from the runway like it was already half dead. The bomber's tires were intact. The engines were still turning. The tail was steady. Then, without warning, the belly dropped. Metal hit concrete with a sound like a train derailment. Sparks sprayed out from under the fuselage. The aircraft slid sideways, screeching, throwing smoke and dust into the cold air. Men ran. A crew chief sprinted toward the cockpit, waving his arms as if his hands could stop 30,000 pounds of aluminum from grinding itself into scrap. Malloy didn't move. He'd seen this too many times to be surprised. The pilot hadn't forgotten the landing gear. He hadn't made a bad approach. He hadn't clipped a wheel. He hadn't been shot up. He hadn't been careless. He'd landed perfectly. And then he'd reached for one lever and grabbed the other. The bomber came to a stop in a long, ugly skid. The propellers bent. The belly was torn open in places. The underside looked like someone had taken a can opener to it. Fuel dripped onto the tarmac in a thin, shining line. Malloy watched the men climb down. No one was bleeding. No one was dead. But that didn't matter. This aircraft was supposed to fly again tonight. And now, it wouldn't. It was always the same story. A crew survived flak, survived fighters, survived a frozen climb to altitude with oxygen masks frosting at the edges, survived hours of tension over hostile territory, survived the long return, running out of fuel, damaged, exhausted, half-deaf from engine noise. They would touch down, safe at last. And then, on the ground, they would destroy their own airplane. The officers called it pilot error. The men on the line called it the stupid lever. Malloy called it something else. A design mistake that was costing them bombers faster than the Luftwaffe. Malloy had been a mechanic before the war, working in a garage outside Baltimore. He was the type who didn't talk much until something broke, and then he became very precise. Not loud, not emotional, just exact. He'd been in England for 9 months, maintaining B-17s for a group that flew deep raids. Every day was the same rhythm: cold metal, oil stains, checklist discipline, rushed repairs, and the constant knowledge that what they did on the ground decided who came back. He knew the B-17 like a map: 4 engines, massive wings, a bomber that could limp home with holes in it that looked impossible. Men called it a flying fortress with pride. But Malloy knew that pride didn't fix stupid. On paper, the cockpit controls were straightforward: landing gear down, flaps up, taxi in, shut down. In practice, the pilot landed after 8 hours of adrenaline, fatigue, and noise. His hands moved on muscle memory. His eyes were scanning gauges. His mind was still up there, still counting fighters, still replaying the moment flak burst too close. And the gear lever and flap lever were right next to each other. Identical, same shape, same feel. In a calm test environment, no problem. In a combat landing, with the aircraft bouncing on the runway and the pilot's heart still hammering, it was a trap. The pilot wanted flaps up to keep the aircraft planted. He grabbed the wrong lever. The gear retracted. The bomber fell onto its belly, and everyone on the ground watched the machine worth a fortune turn into a repair nightmare in seconds. They patched bellies, they replaced props, they swapped parts. They worked through the night, cursing under their breath while the cold dug into their joints. And then it happened again. Malloy started keeping track. He wasn't supposed to. The line didn't run on opinions. It ran on procedures. A sergeant didn't file statistical analyses. He changed spark plugs. He tightened fittings. He signed forms. But he wrote it down anyway. Date, aircraft tail number, pilot name, weather, landing conditions, damage, belly landings, gear retractions, ground accidents that weren't combat losses, but might as well have been. The numbers were ugly. Each one meant a mission cancelled. A crew shifted to a different aircraft. A maintenance team pulled off critical work to fix something that never should have broken. And when you were running a bomber war, cancelled missions did not stay cancelled. They stacked. They concentrated. They forced crews to fly in worse weather, with less rest, with less margin. A simple ground accident was never simple. It had ripples. Malloy noticed something else. Pilots looked ashamed after it happened, not like they'd survived combat, like they'd failed a test. They avoided eye contact. They spoke too quickly, explaining what they thought they'd done, how they'd reached for flaps, how the lever must have felt different in the moment. Officers wrote it down as pilot error. The pilot carried it like a private humiliation. Malloy watched a captain sit on an ammo crate after a belly landing and stare at his hands like they didn't belong to him. That bothered Malloy more than the metal. He'd worked on cars long enough to know a basic rule. When different controls feel the same, people will eventually grab the wrong one. Not because they're dumb, because they're human. One afternoon, a new lieutenant came down the ladder after landing. He was young, pale, and he kept talking like a man trying to outrun his own thoughts. "I don't know what happened," he said. "I swear I went for flaps. I swear I did." Malloy didn't answer right away. He looked at the bomber's belly, at the damage, at the long scrape marks. Then he said, quietly, "You did what your hand knew. Your hand just didn't have enough information." The lieutenant blinked at him. "What do you mean?" Malloy wiped his hands on a rag. "I mean the controls shouldn't feel the same." The lieutenant frowned. "They're standard." "Standard doesn't mean good," Malloy said. That night in the maintenance shack, Malloy took a pencil and drew two levers side by side on a scrap of paper. He wrote above them, "Make them feel different." That was the whole idea. Not a new engine, not a new gun, not better armor, not a new bomb sight. Just a difference you could feel in the dark. Malloy brought it up the next morning to a maintenance officer who had a clean uniform and a habit of looking past enlisted men as if they were part of the equipment. "Sir," Malloy said, "the gear lever and flap lever in the B-17 cockpit. They're identical. Pilots are grabbing the wrong one after touchdown." The officer didn't even look up from the clipboard. "Pilot error." "It's a design problem," Malloy said. The officer finally looked at him. "Are you telling me bomber pilots don't know how to land their own aircraft?" Malloy held his face still. "I'm telling you the cockpit is setting them up to fail." The officer's mouth tightened. "Sergeant, you're not an engineer." "No, sir." "And you're not authorized to modify cockpit controls." "No, sir." "So what exactly are you proposing?" Malloy hesitated, then said it anyway. "A tactile difference. A wheel shape on the gear lever. A flap-shaped wedge on the flap lever. Something obvious by touch." The officer stared like he'd just heard a joke told at the wrong funeral. "You want to glue toys to cockpit controls?" Malloy didn't smile. "I want pilots to stop retracting their landing gear on the runway." The officer shook his head once, slow, disgusted. "That's stupid." Malloy nodded as if he expected that word. Because he did. Every fix that looks obvious after the fact starts out sounding stupid to the people who haven't watched it happen 10 times. The officer dismissed him. The conversation ended the same way most conversations ended in wartime, with procedure winning and men living with the consequences. But Malloy couldn't unsee it now. If the system was built wrong, the system would keep producing the same error until someone changed it. And if the officers wouldn't change it, someone else would. That evening, Malloy walked into the salvage area where damaged aircraft parts sat stacked like bones. He rummaged through boxes until he found what he needed: a small rubber wheel from a piece of ground equipment, a scrap of metal shaped like a wedge from a broken panel. Nothing special, cheap, ugly, improvised. He put them in his coat pocket like contraband. He knew what this was: an unauthorized modification. Not to the airframe, not to flight controls in the air, but to the cockpit interface itself. Still the kind of thing that could get a man chewed out, demoted, or transferred into some miserable duty for making trouble. But he also knew this: they were losing bombers on the runway. Not one a month, not one a season. Enough that the pattern was unmistakable. And the fix might take 10 minutes. The next morning, a B-17 came in with a hard landing. The pilot looked shaken, but he got it down clean. The aircraft rolled out, and Malloy watched the cockpit windows like he always did. No belly drop, no sparks. The bomber taxied in. Malloy exhaled. Then the pilot shut down and climbed out, and he looked at Malloy with a strange expression, half relief, half confusion. In the cockpit later, Malloy saw why. The pilot had reached for the lever after touchdown. He'd felt the rubber wheel on the landing gear control. His hand had paused, registered the shape, and moved to the other lever instead. A fraction of a second. Enough to save the aircraft. Malloy stood in that cockpit for a long moment, looking at the two levers, one with a wheel, one with a wedge. A fix so simple it felt ridiculous, and yet the bomber was intact. Malloy didn't report it, not officially. He didn't ask permission. He just started doing it quietly, one aircraft at a time, the way real fixes spread in war. Through necessity, through whispers, through men who were tired of watching the same stupid thing happen again. Part 2. For the next 2 weeks, Malloy kept his work small and quiet. He didn't march into the operations office demanding policy changes. He didn't write angry memos. He didn't call it a breakthrough. He did what mechanics always do when they think something is wrong. He tested it on one machine, watched what happened, and then did it again. One bomber came back from a long mission to France, bounced on landing, and the pilot's hand went for the levers. Malloy watched from the hard stand. The aircraft stayed on its wheels. The next night, another crew landed in crosswind, fatigued, running on coffee and adrenaline. Same moment, same danger. No belly drop. The pilots didn't even realize what they'd avoided. That was the point. A good fix doesn't require heroism. It removes the need for it. Malloy began to notice a change in the maintenance rhythm. Not dramatic, just less chaos. Fewer emergency repairs caused by ground accidents. More time spent on what mattered: engines, hydraulics, fuel lines, systems damaged by combat. He started hearing different conversations. A crew chief from another line walked over one evening and said, "Hey, Malloy, that thing on your levers. What is that?" Malloy kept his voice low. "A reminder." "A reminder of what?" "Which lever is which?" Malloy said. The crew chief squinted. "That's it?" Malloy shrugged. "That's it." The crew chief looked around like he didn't want anyone else to hear. "Does it work?" Malloy didn't answer right away. He just said, "How many bellies have you seen this month?" The crew chief's jaw tightened. Too many. Malloy nodded once. Then yes. That's how it started. Not with a meeting, not with an order, with a crew chief deciding he'd rather break a rule than scrape another bomber off the runway. The first officer to notice was a captain in operations, who kept track of aircraft availability like a man counting his own heartbeats. He walked out to the line one afternoon, clipboard in hand, and stared at a B-17 cockpit, where the crew chief had left the hatch open. "What is that?" he said, pointing at the levers. The crew chief swallowed. "Markings, sir." The captain frowned. "Those aren't standard." "No, sir." "Who authorized them?" The crew chief looked like he was about to fold. Malloy stepped in before he did. "I did," Malloy said. The captain's eyes narrowed. "You authorized modifications to aircraft cockpit controls?" Malloy kept his tone calm. "I installed tactile identifiers, sir." The captain stared at him like he'd switched languages. "You installed what?" "A wheel on the landing gear control and a wedge on the flap control," Malloy said, "so pilots can feel the difference." The captain's expression shifted from confusion to irritation. "This is a bomber group, Sergeant, not a craft project." Malloy didn't flinch. "How many aircraft have we lost to gear retraction after landing in the last 6 weeks?" The captain's mouth opened, then closed. He didn't like being questioned by a sergeant, but he also knew the answer. Malloy continued, carefully. "This doesn't change procedures. It doesn't change the aircraft systems. It just makes the correct lever obvious by touch." The captain looked at the levers again, and for the first time, his face softened into something like reluctant thought. Then his pride returned. "Remove them." Malloy nodded. "Yes, sir." But he didn't remove them from all aircraft. He removed them from the one aircraft the captain had seen. And he kept installing them on others, quietly, because the pilots kept landing without scraping their bellies open. And that mattered more than a man's clipboard. Malloy understood something the officers didn't always grasp. War didn't reward obedience. War rewarded outcomes. One night, a B-17 returned with a damaged right main tire, landing hard and uneven. The aircraft lurched as it rolled out. The pilot fought the controls, trying to keep it straight. His mind was overloaded. He was right at the edge of a mistake. Malloy stood with his crew in the cold, watching. The pilot's hand reached down, paused, felt the wheel, moved to the wedge. Flaps up, not gear. The bomber stayed upright and rolled to a stop. In a different world, that aircraft would have collapsed and slid sideways, taking out another aircraft parked nearby, starting a chain of damage that would have turned the hardstand into a mess of fire and wreckage. Instead, it ended with a pilot climbing down the ladder and laughing in relief, not knowing why his hand had hesitated at the crucial moment. The next day, Malloy was called into a small office near the hangar. Not a formal interrogation, not a court-martial, just a quiet room with one table and 2 men who didn't usually talk to sergeants unless something had gone wrong. One was a major from Maintenance Command. The other was not military at all. He wore a plain coat, carried a notebook, and had the calm look of someone who listened for a living. The major gestured for Malloy to sit. "Sergeant, you've been installing non-standard cockpit identifiers." Malloy sat. "Yes, sir." The major's tone sharpened. "Without authorization." "Yes, sir." The civilian watched Malloy closely, not with suspicion, but with interest. The major leaned forward. "Explain why." Malloy said what he always said. Simple, exact. "Pilots are retracting landing gear instead of raising flaps after touchdown because the levers feel the same. The fix makes them feel different. The Major scoffed. Pilots should know the difference. The civilian finally spoke. Should they? The Major glanced at him, annoyed. Of course they should. The civilian opened his notebook. In a calm situation, yes. In a high workload environment, identical adjacent controls are an invitation to error. People don't fail randomly, they fail predictably when systems are poorly designed. Malloy didn't know the term for it. He just knew it was true. The Major looked uncomfortable. What exactly have you installed? Malloy described it. Rubber wheel, wedge-shaped piece, fixed to the lever tops so they could be identified by touch. The civilian nodded slowly. A tactile code. The Major said, This is not engineering, this is improvisation. The civilian replied, Improvisation is often the first draft of engineering. The Major's face hardened. We're not approving unauthorized changes because a sergeant thinks he has a better idea. The civilian turned to Malloy. How many belly landings did you see before you started? Malloy answered. Too many. And after? Malloy paused. None on the aircraft we modified. The room went quiet. The Major didn't like silence. It left space for facts. He cleared his throat. Sergeant, you understand the risk. If this interferes with control operation, if it breaks off, if it causes any incident, you will be held responsible. Malloy nodded. Yes, sir. The civilian asked, Can you show me the cockpit? Malloy stood, and the Major reluctantly followed. They walked out to a B-17 with its hatch open. The civilian climbed up into the cockpit like a man stepping into a laboratory. He put his hand on the levers, eyes closed, feeling the shapes. Wheel. Wedge. He nodded to himself, then looked at the Major. This is exactly what I would recommend. The Major's jaw tightened. Recommend to whom? The civilian said, To anyone who wants fewer preventable losses. The Major stared at the levers again, and Malloy saw something like defeat in his face. Because the fix was stupid in the way all good fixes are stupid. It didn't look like war. It looked like common sense. And common sense is often the last thing bureaucracy can admit it needed. The Major said finally, How long does it take to install? Malloy answered, 10 minutes. And how many aircraft could we do in a day? Malloy thought. If the parts are ready, dozens. The civilian closed his notebook. Then we should do dozens. The Major didn't say yes out loud. He didn't say no either. He just walked away, and 2 days later, Malloy received an unofficial message through a crew chief. Keep doing it. Don't talk about it. Make it spread. That was how it became real policy in wartime, not through paperwork, through a quiet decision that it was better to save bombers than to protect pride. Part 3. Once the idea escaped Malloy's hands, it started moving faster than any official memo. A crew chief at Bassingbourn shared it with a friend at another airfield. A pilot mentioned it in a mess hall like a joke. A maintenance sergeant wrote down the shapes on a scrap of paper and mailed it to someone he trusted. Wheel for gear, wedge for flaps, something you could feel even when your brain was still over Germany. Soon, the lever shapes started appearing in cockpits Malloy had never seen. Not perfectly standardized, not pretty. Some men used rubber, some used carved wood, some used metal scrap, whatever was available. But the principle was the same. Make the controls distinct by touch. And the ground accidents started dropping. Not because pilots got smarter overnight, because the system stopped punishing them for being human. Malloy heard pilots talk differently when they returned. Before, when a belly landing happened, there was shame. a kind of quiet humiliation that followed a man like exhaust smoke. He'd survived flak and fighters, then failed at the last second on the runway. After the shape spread, the shame faded, because the mistake stopped happening. And that changed the psychology of a bomber group in a way no speech could. Crews started trusting the landing sequence again. They stopped fearing that the worst moment might be the one after the mission was over. They landed, rolled out, and climbed down with the exhausted relief that they deserved to feel. The ripple wasn't just fewer damaged aircraft, it was fewer broken nerves. But war doesn't let fixes stay invisible forever. Someone high up always notices when the numbers change. A month later, a maintenance inspector arrived with a team. Clipboard, white gloves, the unmistakable smell of someone whose work happened on paper. He walked down the line, checking aircraft, marking small discrepancies, feeling important. Then he climbed into a cockpit and saw the levers. He froze. These are non-standard. The crew chief tried to speak. Sir, they're just... Who authorized this? The crew chief hesitated. The inspector's eyes hardened. Remove them. Immediately. The crew chief swallowed. Sir, with respect, they prevent accidental gear retraction after touchdown. The inspector stared. That is pilot error. The crew chief, braver than he realized, said, Sir, it used to be. Now it isn't. That inspector wrote a report. He sent it upward. He used the right words. Unauthorized modification, deviation from standard configuration, risk to safety and procedure. And the report landed on desks where decisions were made by men who had not watched a B-17 collapse onto its belly in the grey dawn. For a moment, the entire fix was in danger of being crushed by the machine it was helping. Malloy heard about the report the way enlisted men hear about everything. Whispers, a warning passed hand to hand. They're coming down on it. Stop installing them. Hide them before inspections. So they did. They removed the shapes before inspections and put them back afterward. The levers became a secret, not because they were wrong, because the system wasn't ready to admit it had been wrong. That's the strange truth about wartime innovation. A fix can be saving lives and still be treated like contraband. Malloy kept his head down, but he watched the bureaucracy begin its slow response. The same pattern every time. First, denial, then investigation, then cautious approval after the benefit becomes too obvious to ignore. A civilian report was commissioned. A specialist reviewed cockpit layouts. Interviews were conducted. Pilots were asked the same question again and again. How could you possibly retract the gear after landing? The pilots answered honestly. Because the levers feel the same. Because I was exhausted. Because it happened fast. Because I reached for flaps and my hand grabbed gear. The same truth, repeated until even the most stubborn officer had to admit the pattern. Then someone finally used the words that mattered. It's not just pilot error, it's system error. That single phrase was a kind of revolution. Because once you say the system is part of the problem, you have to fix the system, not just punish the person. The lever shapes were no longer a joke. They were a solution. In one briefing, an officer tried to dismiss it anyway. This is not the kind of thing that wins a war. A pilot in the back of the room, older, tired, and done with nonsense, spoke up. Sir, every bomber we don't scrape off the runway flies again. That wins a war. The room went quiet. A week later, a directive came down. Not written like a confession, written like a decision that had always been obvious. Cockpit lever tactile identifiers will be standardized. Landing gear control will be distinct by feel. Flap control will be distinct by feel. No mention of Malloy, no mention of the crew chiefs who had spread it. No mention of the quiet rebellion that kept bombers in the air. Just a clean, official document that acted like the idea had arrived through proper channels. That's how it always goes. War takes what works, then it forgets where it came from. Malloy didn't care about credit, not really. He cared about the line staying full of aircraft that could fly tonight and tomorrow and next week. He cared about crews coming back and stepping onto the tarmac instead of crawling out of wreckage. And when the belly landings stopped, the impact was larger than anyone could measure in one place. Because it wasn't just his airfield, it was dozens, then hundreds, then across the bomber force. How many aircraft were saved? No one could say with certainty. War is too large for clean accounting. But everyone understood the principle. Preventing one preventable accident doesn't just save one bomber. It saves the chain of consequences that bomber would have dragged behind it. The cancelled mission, the exhausted replacement crew, the rushed maintenance on another aircraft, the overworked mechanics, the stressed pilots, the mistakes that follow. A small fix can stabilize a whole system. All it takes is the right change at the right point of failure. And in a bomber war, one of the most dangerous points of failure was a pilot's hand reaching for a lever at the wrong second. Wheel, wedge, two shapes that turned chaos into clarity. Part 4. Malloy stayed on the line through the spring and summer. The raids continued. The losses continued. Men still died. But one category of loss, the one that had always felt stupid and cruel, faded. You could still lose a bomber to flak. You could still lose one to fighters. You could still lose one to weather and mechanical failure. But you stopped losing them because a cockpit asked the human brain to do something unreasonable after 8 hours of stress. That mattered, not because it was dramatic, because it was sane. The officers eventually learned to talk about it in the right language. They called it human factors. They called it systems design. They called it engineering improvement. But on the line, the mechanics called it what it had always been, the stupid gear trick. And they said stupid with affection because it had saved them work, saved aircraft, saved crews from humiliation, and kept bombers available when availability was life. Malloy never received a medal for it. There was no ceremony where a general shook his hand and thanked him for making the war machine better. His name did not appear in the neat final reports that would be filed away in archives. The credit, when it came, went to the official channels, the specialists, the investigators, the men who wrote the document. Malloy understood something else. Credit was not the point. Survival was. And survival in war is often won by changes too small to look heroic. After the war, Malloy went home to Baltimore. He returned to the garage, back to engines that didn't carry men into flak. He got married. He had kids. He kept his hands busy and his stories quiet. When people asked what he did in the war, he usually answered the same way. I fixed airplanes, and that was true. But there was one detail he never mentioned, unless he trusted the person listening. He would say almost casually, "Sometimes the problem isn't the person, it's the way the machine is built." He would pause, then add, "And sometimes all it takes is making two levers feel different." In the 1990s, long after most of the men from that line were gone, a historian researching cockpit design changes in World War II found references to lever shape coding. It appeared in technical notes, in training references, in post-war standards that became so normal no one thought to ask why they existed. The historian traced it backward, past official documentation, past clean reports. And like most real innovations in war, the trail didn't lead to a general. It led to the line, to mechanics, to pilots, to small decisions made under pressure when the cost of doing nothing was too high. The historian interviewed surviving airmen who remembered the change. Some said it saved aircraft, some said it saved their nerves. One pilot, old now, laughed quietly and said, "It saved me from myself." Because that's what a good system does. It doesn't demand perfection from exhausted humans. It builds in forgiveness. It makes the correct action easier than the incorrect one. In a war that devoured machines and men, that kind of forgiveness was rare. And it came not from a committee, but from a mechanic who watched the same mistake happen until he couldn't stand it anymore. That's how these stories usually go. A war machine is enormous. It looks like it runs on steel and orders and strategy. But it's held together by small points of failure. And when someone changes one of those points, the entire machine shifts. Not with a headline, with a quiet reduction in needless loss. If this story stuck with you, take a moment to like the video. It helps these forgotten details reach the people who still care about how history really works. Subscribe if you want more stories like this, the ones that don't begin in conference rooms or speeches, but in cold hangars and hard stands, where someone notices a problem and fixes it without waiting to be told. And if you're watching from somewhere with its own history of mechanics, pilots, crew chiefs, or quiet problem solvers, share it in the comments. Because this kind of story isn't just World War II. It's how progress happens anywhere humans are trying to survive inside machines. Wheel, wedge, a stupid trick, and a reminder that sometimes the smallest changes save the most lives.